Last time we talked about the different types of somatic sensory receptors, their locations, and the types of sensory stimuli that they will convey. So the first thing we've got to remember is that our receptors are out in the periphery somewhere. And these receptors can be the dendrites of sensory neurons or receptors that are physically connected to sensory neurons. And the type of sensory neuron that they will be connected to will be our first-order neurons. These are our pseudo-unipolar neurons that will have their cell bodies either within a dorsal root ganglion or a cranial nerve ganglion. And this is going to be our peripheral afferent that's going to bring information into the central nervous system. The first-order neuron will then synapse on a second-order neuron that is somewhere within the central nervous system. It can be within the spinal cord or the brainstem, and it will then relay its information to higher brain areas. In some of these pathways, we will have a third-order neuron, because in some of these pathways, we will have the second-order neuron synapsing within the ventral nuclei of the thalamus. From there, that information will be processed. Some of it will be filtered out, but some of it will be relayed up to the primary somatosensory cortex. And this will be done via third-order neurons that arise from the thalamus. So, if our pathway has only two neurons in it, first and second order, then we won't become consciously aware of the sensation. That is, we will not perceive it. However, this information can be used for all kinds of things like adjusting motor tone and balance and posture and these kinds of things. The third-order neuron is what will bring an actual sensation to the cerebral cortex where it can then become a perception. So remember, perception is the conscious awareness of a stimulus. Sensation is simply a stimulus activating a receptor, and that sensation being received in the central nervous system. All right, let's look at some of our somatic sensory pathways. We've got three major ones that we're going to tackle today. We're going to look at the spinothalamic pathway, which, as the name implies, the second-order neuron is going to have its cell body in the spine, somewhere in the spinal cord, and it will synapse in the thalamus. From this, we will have a third-order neuron arising from the thalamus going to our primary somatosensory cortex. Now, the second pathway is called the posterior column, sometimes known as the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. And this is going to have axons that will be traveling in the white matter tracts, the posterior part of the spinal cord, and these are called the fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis. And we've seen the nucleus cuneatus and nucleus gracilis in the medulla oblongata, and indeed, this is where these first-order neurons will synapse. They will travel up in these columns, so the axons of these first-order neurons will come into the spinal cord, ascend to the level of the medulla oblongata, cross over, and then be relayed to the thalamus once again. So then third-order neurons will arise from the thalamus and continue on to the primary somatosensory cortex. The spinocerebellar pathway is going to be one in which we do not have conscious awareness because the second-order neurons will end in the cerebellum. And this will help the cerebellum adjust through the sensations that it's getting. It will be able to adjust our postural muscles and reflexes for things like balance and postural tone. All right, let's have a look at them. So here we have our spinothalamic pathway, and we have two different parts. We have an anterior spinothalamic tract and a lateral spinothalamic tract. In the spinocerebellar pathway, we're going to have an anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tract, which will be running along the lateral edge of the spinal cord. And then our posterior column pathway, as the name implies, is going to be traveling within the posterior white columns. And these will be divided into the fasciculus gracilis, which is going to be bringing proprioceptive and fine touch information from the legs, the lower limbs, and the trunk, the lower trunk. And then the fasciculus cuneatus, the wedge-shaped one on the outside, is going to be the one bringing information from the upper trunk and the upper limbs. So once again, these are going to mirror the nuclei within the medulla oblongata, and indeed, the first-order neurons coming from the periphery will travel up through, their axons will travel up through these fasciculi, and they will then synapse in the nuclei of the medulla oblongata, where they will then cross over, synapse in the thalamus, and then third order neurons will arise from there. All right, so now let's look first at the spinothalamic pathway. This is going to give us conscious sensations of crude touch, pain, temperature, pressure, and so forth. So our first order neurons are going to enter the spinal cord and synapse on second order neurons within the posterior gray horns. Remember our somatic sensory nuclei in that posterior part of the posterior gray horns. So those second order neurons are going to rise up within the spinal cord. They're going to cross over. In most of them, they're going to rise up through the spinal cord, and then they are going to ascend through the spinothalamic tract, and they will then ascend to the thalamus, the ventral nuclei of the thalamus. The third order neurons basically are going to be from the thalamus and will relay the sensations up to the primary somatosensory cortex. So if we have a look, here's our first order neuron coming in, and this is the anterior spinothalamic tract, and so this is going to convey information about crude touch and pressure sensations. And so we're on the right side of the body here, so it will be receiving information from the right side of the body and cross over and be processed in the left hemisphere, as we know, because most of these pathways will cross over before they reach the hemispheres, so before they reach cerebral cortex. So here's our first order neuron coming in. Here's its neuron cell body in the posterior dorsal root ganglion. It will synapse in that posterior gray horn. Then this second order neuron, whose body is in that posterior gray horn, will send its axons across to the other side of the spinal cord, and that axon will then ascend in the anterior spinothalamic tract all the way up to the ventral nuclei of the thalamus. And then from there, that information will be processed, sorted. What doesn't need to be sent up to primary sensory cortex for additional information, that will be filtered out. So this would be an irrelevant stimuli. Something that is relevant will be processed and then relayed up to the primary somatosensory cortex. One thing I want you to notice about the primary somatosensory cortex is this sort of body representation here. There is a map of the body on the primary somatosensory cortex. Just as we saw that in the primary motor cortex, certain parts of cortex control certain parts of the body. Certain parts of the primary sensory cortex will contain a map of sensation for a certain part of the body. So that here on the lateral side, we can see we have representation of face, lips, jaw, tongue here. Here's the hand. So a lot of this cortex is dedicated to hands. And you can understand why, because we do a lot of our interface with our environment with our hands. So this is going to have a lot of sensory information. This is where our receptive fields will be very, very small and very densely packed together. So we're going to have our high fidelity, if you will, processing here. So we're going to have more cortex dedicated to hands than, say, we will the trunk or the ankle or something like that. So another area, the lips, are also very sensitive. So they're going to have a fairly large proportion of sensory cortex dedicated to them, much larger in proportion to the actual body part. All right, so this is now the lateral spinothalamic tract. This is going to convey information about pain and temperature. So once again, we have our first order neuron coming in, synapsing in our posterior gray horn here. Again, that axon from the second order neuron will cross over. It will ascend in the lateral spinothalamic tract, again, synapse in the ventral nuclei of the thalamus, and then a third order neuron will arise from the thalamus and project to the primary sensory cortex. Now, what's interesting about this is in the spinothalamic tract, especially in the lateral spinothalamic tract, sometimes there can be interneurons that are receiving information from other parts of the body. So, for example, you could be receiving visceral information. Some of that will be carried to interneurons in the spinothalamic tract. And what will happen is we will get a pain sensation from a part of the body that's not actually being stimulated. So sometimes we can have visceral pain from the stomach, the gallbladder, the heart, or something like that that's arriving at the same segment of the spinal cord and can stimulate interneurons that are part of the spinothalamic pathway. And this is called referred pain. So, for example, the most famous referred pain is that of a heart attack. So a lot of times if people are having a heart attack, they will have referred pain down the left arm, sometimes in the neck. In women, it's very common to have that referred pain in the neck and in the jaw. So this is one of the telltale signs if someone comes in and they're having extreme, not just chest pain, but they're having referred pain down the arm, up the neck, and through the jaw, that they might be suffering a heart attack. There are other referred pain areas that you're likely to feel sensation on that part of the body when actually it's an organ that's being stimulated, that there's some kind of visceral pain going on there. So, for example, the liver and gallbladder, they can refer to the shoulder and to the rib cage. So we have some other some other organs here, and they're referred pain areas that are likely to be felt on the surface of the body. So if you have appendicitis, you might feel a sharp pain on the right side of your body, on the surface of your body. Over here, we have, if there's pain in the ureters, let's say you have a urinary tract infection, you may feel pain coming over the top of the iliac crest and down into the inguinal region. All right, let's look at the posterior column pathway now. This is going to carry sensations of fine touch temperature vibrations, fine touch pressure vibration and proprioception. So remember, our proprioception is where our body parts are in space. So this is going to tell us things like where my hand is, it's up high, it's not down here, that kind of thing. And this is receiving information, remember, from our muscle spindles, Golgi tendons, our free nerve endings in our joint capsules and so forth. So we're going to get our proprioceptive receptors involved here. So once again, muscle spindles, Golgi tendon apparatus, free nerve endings in joints, this kind of thing. We have our two tracts. We have our fasciculus gracilis, that's the one coming up in the center. And that's the long, thin one. Remember, gracile means basically long and thin or slender. And then our fasciculus cuneatus, and cuneatus means wedge-shaped. So once again, our fasciculus gracilis is going to be bringing these sensations from the lower limbs and lower trunk, and the fasciculus cuneatus is going to be bringing sensation from the upper parts of the body and the upper limbs. All right, so here we're going to have a slightly different arrangement. So it's probably easier just to have a look at it. And here it is. So here we have our first order neuron coming in, and it's going to ascend the axon of this thing. It's not going to synapse immediately in our posterior gray horn. So this is our peripheral afferent coming in, our first order neuron, and its axon will continue in the spinal cord through these tracts, and it will ascend to our nuclei in the medulla oblongata. So within the gracile nucleus and the cuneate nucleus, we're going to be receiving these axons that will be either in the fasciculus gracilis or the fasciculus cuneatus, respectively. Once they get into this nucleus of the medulla oblongata, they will synapse there. And then our second order neuron will arise from here, cross over to the other side, and will ascend in what's called the medial lemniscus. And lemniscus just means a ribbon. So sometimes this whole thing is called the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. And from here, our second order neuron will ascend once again into the ventral nuclei of the thalamus, and it will then synapse on a third order neuron that will then relay the appropriate information to the primary sensory cortex. Once again, notice this map of the body. This is called a homunculus, which means little man. That's what it means. So if you were to make a model of the sensory homunculus, it would look like this. And basically, it's just a projection or a map of what body parts are represented on what part of the cortex. So if you took someone in the laboratory and stimulated this part of the cortex, they would feel sensation in their hands. If you stimulated this part of the cortex in here, they would feel sensation in their toes. Likewise, if you stimulated around in here, you would generate sensations on the face. All right, now let's look at the spinocerebellar pathway. This is going to provide the cerebellum with proprioceptive information. So this is going to tell us about skeletal muscles, tendons, and joints. This is going to be very important because remember that the cerebellum is adjusting postural tone ongoing motor movements. And to do this, it has to have some kind of sensory feedback or sensory information of what's going on. So it really can't adjust motor movements if it doesn't have information about the skeletal muscles, about the length of the skeletal muscles or where the body parts are in space. So this pathway will never reach our consciousness. It will never reach perception. It will only be a sensation because that information will end at the cerebellum. So the second order neurons will have their cell bodies in the spine, in those nuclei, and then it will ascend to the cerebellum, and it will end there. And once again, we know that the cerebellum is not involved in conscious perception or conscious processing. It simply is continually adjusting ongoing motor movement, postural tone, and so forth. All right, so we've got posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts. And one of the things that's interesting here is this posterior spinocerebellar tracts do not cross over to the other side. They actually stay on the same side and will reach the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now, in contrast, the anterior spinocerebellar tracts do cross. And so they will have, most of their axons will have crossed over to the opposite side of the spinal cord. And then they will travel to the cerebellum by the superior cerebellar peduncles. And interestingly, a lot of those neurons, once they reach their targets, will actually cross back over. So you have a double cross. Nobody knows why that is, but a lot of the proprioceptive information that's being received by the cerebellum is going to be on the same side of the body. So let's have a look. Here we have in our anterior spinocerebellar tract, here we have a first order neuron coming in. It's going to synapse in that posterior gray horn. Then we're going to have that neuron's axon cross over and ascend in the anterior spinocerebellar tract, and it will come up into the cerebellum. Sometimes it will cross over before it gets there to the other side. Whereas in the posterior spinocerebellar pathway, we'll have our first order coming in, our first order neuron coming in, synapsing in that posterior gray horn. The axon from our second order neuron will ascend and stay on the same side and synapse on the cerebellum on the same side as the side of the body that the information came in. All right, so most of our somatic sensory information that we will become consciously aware of or that we will perceive will be relayed to the thalamus for processing. And remember, only about 1% of it is actually going to make it to consciousness, to perception. We're constantly filtering out things that don't matter, irrelevant stimuli, things that would just overload us if we had to pay attention to them. So the thalamus's job is very important because if it didn't do a lot of this, not only is it going to process and figure out which type of stimulus it is, what labeled line it belongs to, and send it to the right part of the cerebellar cortex, the cerebral cortex, but it's also going to be very important just for filtering out stuff that we don't need to pay attention to. All right, so when we look at the visceral sensory pathways, these are going to be coming from the organs. These are going to be coming from interoreceptors, things that are deep within the body. So these are going to be things like stomach, intestinal tract, lungs, heart, this kind of thing. And so the interoreceptors, first of all, they're not going to be as numerous in the somatic tissues, i.e. the skin, the dermis, even in the proprioceptors. They're just not going to be as many of them. So the receptive fields for these are pretty weak. We don't have proprioceptors in our organs either, so we can't tell by feel where our stomach is or where our liver is. So that's an important distinction. And the interoreceptors just don't provide as much information about where stimulus is coming from. So you hear people say, well, my tummy hurts. And they'll, well, which part? They couldn't tell you whether it was the stomach, the small intestine, or the pancreas, or, Sometimes we can get clues through referred pain, but we're not going to have the same sensory resolution of the viscera that we do of the somatic sensory pathways. All right, so we got to remember the types of interoreceptors that we're dealing with. Nociceptors for pain, for example, when you get stomach cramps or whatever. Thermoreceptors for when you drank your coffee too hot, now it's burning your esophagus and your stomach. Tactile receptors, so when you know something's in there because it's touching you. Baroreceptors or pressure receptors, you're going to find those, for example, in the bladder and in the stomach. When things get distended in distensible organs, you're going to find them in blood vasculature. That's another place you'll find baroreceptors. And chemoreceptors. And the chemoreceptors will not convey information that we can become conscious of. These are going to be things that are going to tell us information about dissolved gases, so oxygen, carbon dioxide content, pH, dissolved hydrogen ion concentrations. This is going to be used by the areas of the brain that will be regulating reflexes, visceral reflexes. These are not going to be anything that we will become consciously aware of. They will not reach our perception. However, these things can. So nociceptors, thermoreceptors, tactile and baroreceptors are all things that can reach our conscious awareness. All right, they are going to be relayed through something called the solitary nucleus. And this is that nucleus we saw in the medulla oblongata. And this is going to process and sort information for visceral sensory information. So we're going to have, because visceral reflexes and visceral stimulation is going to be strongly linked to states of awareness and the autonomic regulation of these things, we're going to have extensive connections of the solitary nucleus with the cardiovascular and respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata, with the reticular formation, which spans the entire brainstem. So it's really hard to fall asleep if you have a really strong stomach pain. So a lot of times these pathways will stimulate your awareness and will be very much involved in regulating some of our reflexes, our visceral reflexes. All right, so now we have talked about the sensory pathways. Now let's talk a little bit about the motor pathways. So we're going to segue out of our sensation here, and we're going to talk about the somatic motor system, or the somatic nervous system that controls our skeletal muscles. We've talked about that before. And then, of course, that is different from our autonomic nervous system, which, as we know, is going to control the visceral effectors. And here we're talking about smooth muscle that you find in skin, in blood vessels, in the digestive tract, lining just about any hollow organ. You've got smooth muscles, cardiac muscle, glands such as sweat glands, digestive glands. These are going to be under the control of the autonomic nervous system, and also adipose tissue. They didn't put that on the slide, but adipose tissue is under the control of the autonomic nervous system. As we know, the sympathetic nervous system will cause the adipocytes to release their triglycerides for energy. All right, let's look at our somatic motor pathways. As we recall, we have an upper motor neuron that's originating from the brain somewhere. And then we have a lower motor neuron. So this upper motor neuron will synapse either in like a brainstem nucleus or in one of those nuclei in the anterior gray horns of the spinal cord. And then we have a lower motor neuron. And that's the thing that's going to leave the spinal cord or the brainstem nucleus and go out to the effector. This is the efferent that exits the central nervous system and innervates an effector, which in this case is going to be a skeletal muscle. So we're going to have basically the upper motor neurons are in some central nervous system processing centers. A lot of these are going to be in that primary motor cortex. And so basically, when we have this upper motor neuron, it's going to synapse on the lower motor neuron, which will innervate a single motor unit and a skeletal muscle. So we can also have some activity in the upper motor neurons that can facilitate or inhibit a lower motor neuron. Remember when we talked about some of our reflexes, and there can be some interneurons so that we can have the crossed extensor reflex, the reciprocal inhibition, and so forth. So remember that sometimes the upper motor neuron may inhibit a lower motor neuron as well as stimulate it directly. All right, so our lower motor neurons are going to have their cell bodies either in the brainstem nucleus or that anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. This is what's going to cause the contraction of the innervated muscle. So the axon of the lower motor neuron is going to extend outside the outside the central nervous system. So as we say, it's the efferent that exits the CNS and stimulates an effector. And this is going to be what makes the muscle move. So basically, if we lose that lower motor neuron, then we will lose the voluntary control over the innervated motor unit as well as the reflex control. A lot of times, You can, for example, if people put Botox in the muscles of their neck or in the muscles of their face, they're actually damaging, or they're basically preventing acetylcholine release at the neuromuscular junction. And that's what makes people's face look flat. And that's what makes people basically, well, it eliminates wrinkles because it will keep people from making facial expressions. But also, Botox is a treatment that's used for migraines. So people who have constant muscle tension in their neck and in their face and their head will sometimes have Botox treatments, basically to prevent innervation of these pathways or these motor effectors, so that there's not as much tension in them. And this can be a bad thing. It can be very good for some people who have chronic intractable migraines, but sometimes it can go too far. Typically, their new neuromuscular junctions will be established and new axons will find their way to these targets. So the Botox treatments only last a few months. And of course, nobody really wants to destroy innervation of motor units anyway, unless it's absolutely, to control some kind of intractable pain.